My sister dragged me by the wrist to meet her fiancé's multimillionaire father at her rehearsal dinner. She smirked and introduced me as the family failure. My mother chimed in saying they never brag about me because I am just a lowly paper pusher. But the billionaire froze, dropped his crystal glass, and whispered that he never expected to see me there. What my family did not know was that this man had been begging to hire me for months. My name is Kendra, 33 years old, and for my entire life I was the punchline to my family's cruel jokes. As a high-level forensic auditor, I spent my days unearthing the dark financial secrets of the ultra-wealthy. I was an anonymous asset recovery specialist, but to my family, I was just a pathetic bookkeeper. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. The clinking of silver forks against fine china echoed through the private dining room of the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in Chicago. I sat quietly at the edge of the room, sipping sparkling water in a drab, ill-fitting gray bridesmaid dress. My sister Chelsea, the golden child of the family, was practically glowing in her custom white silk gown. She was marrying Jamal, a charismatic African-American man who flashed his family wealth like a badge of honor. His father Desmond was a self-made billionaire and the ruthless founder of a massive investment firm. I was perfectly content hiding in the corner, but Chelsea could never miss an opportunity to put me down. She marched over, grabbed my wrist, and her manicured nails dug into my skin. She pulled me aggressively toward the VIP table where Jamal and Desmond were seated. "Come here, Kendra," she hissed under her breath. "It is time you meet Desmond properly." Chelsea pulled me into the center of the room, making sure the attention of all 50 guests was squarely on us. "Mr. Desmond Chelsea," announced loudly, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I do not think you have officially met my older sister Kendra. She is our family failure. Every family has one right." A wave of uncomfortable laughter rippled across the table. Jamal chuckled and shook his head. "My father." Richard laughed loudly while swirling his expensive scotch. My mother Patricia leaned forward and sighed dramatically, playing the role of the burdened parent. "Oh, Chelsea, do not be so mean," my mother said, though she was smiling. "But it is true, Desmond. We really do not brag about her. She is just a lowly paper pusher. Someone has to do the boring bookkeeping, I suppose." I kept my face completely blank, waiting for the familiar wave of humiliation to wash over me. I had endured this exact type of public shaming for decades. But Desmond did not laugh. He did not even smile. He stared at me, his eyes widening in absolute shock. The heavy crystal wine glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the polished marble floor. The sharp crash caused the entire room to go dead silent. Even the jazz band in the corner abruptly stopped playing. Desmond stood up slowly, completely ignoring the red wine pooling around his expensive leather shoes. "So it is you," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying a strange mix of disbelief and intense respect. "This is highly unexpected." Chelsea let out a nervous little laugh, stepping forward to touch his arm. "I know, right? Her dress is so plain and embarrassing. I told her to at least try to look presentable for your sake." Desmond whipped his head toward Chelsea, his expression instantly turning to stone. "Quiet," he barked, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who commanded thousands of employees. Chelsea recoiled as if she had been physically slapped. Desmond turned his attention back to me, ignoring my completely stunned parents. He stepped closer, shaking his head in absolute bewilderment. "I have spent the last 3 months and over $2 million in retainer fees trying to secure a single private meeting with your firm. I have been begging for your help. Why on earth is the woman who charges $5,000 an hour for elite forensic consulting standing here in a cheap bridesmaid dress, being insulted by these clueless people?" The silence that followed his words was deafening. My mother dropped her fork, my father choked on his scotch, and Jamal, the arrogant groom, suddenly went incredibly pale. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel worthless. Now they would learn exactly how much I was worth. My father broke the heavy silence first. He let out a booming, forced laugh that echoed awkwardly off the crystal chandeliers overhead. He slapped his hand against the white tablecloth, shaking his head side to side as if Desmond had just delivered the punchline to a completely ridiculous joke. "You must have her confused with someone else, Desmond," my father said, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. "Trust me, this is just Kendra. We know our own daughter. She certainly does not own any high-profile consulting firm. She works in a cubicle somewhere downtown, pushing papers for middle management. And as for charging $5,000 an hour, well, just look at her. She buys her clothes off the clearance rack at discount department stores. She is hardly the elite financial savior you are looking for." Desmond did not laugh. His jaw tightened, and he looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "I do not make mistakes," Richard Desmond said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that demanded absolute respect. "And I certainly do not mistake the woman who single-handedly traced and recovered $70 million in offshore embezzlements for a multinational tech conglomerate last year. My firm has been tracking her career trajectory for 18 months. As for her clothes, the fact that you think she is wearing department store clearance speaks volumes about your own blinding ignorance. That suit your daughter is wearing is a custom $12,000 Tom Ford masterclass in bespoke tailoring." A collective gasp swept through the VIP table. My mother dropped her hands into her lap, her mouth hanging open as she stared at my gray suit, suddenly seeing the flawless stitching and premium fabric in a completely different light. Chelsea took a quick step back, her eyes darting frantically between me and Desmond, trying to process a reality that completely shattered her worldview. Jamal, however, looked completely physically ill. A thick bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. He nervously tugged at the stiff collar of his tuxedo shirt, looking exactly like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to salvage the situation, but no words came out. He just kept wiping his forehead with a monogrammed silk napkin, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. But Chelsea could not process the information rationally. Instead of realizing how horribly she had treated me her entire life, her shock immediately twisted into intense, furious resentment. Her face turned blotchy, and red clashing violently with the elegant aesthetic of her pristine white gown. "Are you kidding me right now?" Chelsea shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet dining room and causing several guests at other tables to turn around. "You have been sitting on millions of dollars this whole time, and you never bothered to tell us. You sat there and let Mom and Dad take out a massive second mortgage on their house just to help pay for my wedding. You are so incredibly selfish, Kendra. You let our family go into crippling debt while you were secretly hoarding a massive fortune." My mother immediately jumped to Chelsea's defense, her shock instantly transforming into self-righteous anger. "How could you lie to us like this, Kendra?" my mother demanded, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "Your sister deserves the perfect wedding, and you could have easily paid for the whole thing without breaking a sweat. You deliberately hid your money just to watch us struggle. You have always been so spiteful and jealous of her happiness." I stood perfectly still, letting their bitter accusations wash over me. It was almost comical in its predictability. They were not apologizing for decades of emotional abuse and neglect. They were not expressing pride in my immense professional success. They were furious that I had not allowed them to exploit my bank account to fund their superficial lifestyle. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my $12,000 jacket. The room grew entirely quiet again as everyone at the table watched my hand. I pulled out a long, neatly folded piece of crisp white paper. I held it up between my index and middle finger, letting the warm overhead light catch the printed ink. "I am not quite sure why you are yelling at me about wedding expenses, Chelsea," I said, my voice completely calm, measured, and devoid of any emotion. "Because I actually did step up to help with your perfect wedding tonight." I leaned forward and placed the paper gently on the table right next to Jamal's empty dinner plate. It was the itemized receipt from the restaurant. "What is that?" my father snapped, leaning forward to squint at the paper through his reading glasses. "That is the final receipt for tonight," I replied smoothly. "All 50 guests. The imported Wagyu beef, the rare truffles, the endless bottles of vintage champagne you and your friends have been throwing back all evening. The grand total came to exactly $40,000. Chelsea scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. So what Jamal is paying for the rehearsal dinner? He told us he had it completely handled. He comes from a billionaire family, unlike you. I locked eyes with Jamal, watching all the remaining color completely drain from his face. He looked like he was about to pass out right there at the table. He tried to handle it, I said, keeping my unwavering gaze fixed on my soon-to-be brother-in-law. But about 20 minutes ago, the restaurant manager pulled me aside quietly. He knew I was the only other person in the room with the liquid capital to save you all from getting arrested for theft of services. I paid the $40,000 bill, Chelsea, because Jamal presented his exclusive black card to the waiter, and it was flatly declined for insufficient funds. Jamal slammed both of his hands onto the table with such violent force that the silverware clattered sharply against the fine china plates. His chair scraped harshly against the polished marble floor as he shot up to his feet. "You are out of your mind!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with raw panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his eyes wide and frantic. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a liar and a complete fraud. She is trying to sabotage my entire life." He looked frantically toward his father, whose expression remained as cold and unforgiving as carved granite. "Dad, you have to believe me," Jamal pleaded, the smooth, arrogant confidence he had worn all evening completely evaporating into thin air. "She is not some elite forensic auditor. She is a dangerous corporate spy. She has been stalking my personal accounts and hacking into my private servers for weeks. That is exactly why my card declined tonight. It was not because I have insufficient funds. It was because my entire financial portfolio was frozen this afternoon by the bank due to a massive security breach, and she is the one who caused it." Jamal paced a few steps behind his chair, wiping his sweating forehead again with the back of his hand, rapidly spinning a web of desperate, chaotic lies. "She used her position to bypass our firewalls. She has been trying to frame me because she is obsessed with ruining Chelsea's life. She could not stand watching her younger sister marry into our family, so she orchestrated this entire sick charade. She paid the restaurant bill just so she could stand here tonight and make me look like a fool in front of you, Dad. It is a setup. It is a complete trap." My parents did not even pause to consider the utter absurdity of Jamal's frantic claims. They did not stop to question how a woman they believed was a lowly paper pusher could suddenly hack a billionaire's heavily guarded corporate servers. They only heard exactly what they wanted to hear. Chelsea began to sob loudly into her hands, burying her face into my mother's shoulder, playing the perfect, helpless victim. And that was all the permission my parents needed to unleash their absolute fury on me. "You are sick, Kendra!" My father roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He stood up, towering over me with fists clenched tightly at his sides. "We knew you were a bitter, unhappy person, but this is a new low even for you. To go to these extreme lengths just to destroy your own sister's rehearsal dinner. You hacked his bank accounts just to make his credit card decline. Are you completely insane? You could go to federal prison for this type of cybercrime." My mother rushed to Chelsea's side, wrapping her arms protectively around my crying sister, while glaring at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "We should have never invited you." Patricia spat, her voice trembling with intense rage. "You have been insanely jealous of Chelsea since the day she was born. You could never stand the fact that she is beautiful, that she is loved, and that she found a wealthy, successful man. You have absolutely nothing in your pathetic life, so you decided to tear down everything she has built. You are a monster." Desmond watched the chaotic scene unfold with narrowed, calculating eyes. He absorbed every single word being shouted in the room. He did not rush to comfort his son. He simply watched me. I remained perfectly still, my posture straight, and my expression completely neutral. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not frantically defend myself against my parents' venomous insults. When you spend your entire career hunting white-collar criminals and corporate embezzlers, you learn very quickly that the loudest person in the room is always the guilty one. And Jamal was practically screaming at the top of his lungs. Jamal, clearly emboldened by my parents blindly taking his side without a shred of evidence, reached quickly into his tailored tuxedo jacket. "If you want proof, I have it right here," he declared triumphantly, a sinister smile creeping onto his face. He pulled out a neatly folded document that bore the official embossed letterhead of his father's investment firm, D Corp Investments. He threw it aggressively onto the center of the dining table, right next to my restaurant receipt. I received an emergency alert from our internal compliance department just a few hours ago. Jamal announced, his voice gaining a sickening level of false confidence. They tracked a massive unauthorized wire transfer that drained exactly $5 million from the company's employee pension fund. And the security team traced the digital breach directly back to a single source. "Look at the paper, Dad." The transfer was initiated from Kendra's exact home IP address. "She did not just hack my cards. She stole $5 million from your company." Desmond stared at the forged bank document, his face entirely unreadable. But my father did not need to wait for Desmond to pass judgment or conduct an investigation. Richard lunged forward, his large hand wrapping around my upper arm with a bruising, aggressive grip. Before I could even process the sudden physical assault, he began dragging me away from the VIP table in front of everyone. "We are handling this right now in private," my father growled, his thick fingers digging painfully into my skin. He pulled me past the stunned waiters and shoved me roughly through a heavy oak door near the back of the restaurant, leading us straight into the establishment's private climate-controlled wine cellar. My mother followed quickly behind us, slamming the thick door shut and sliding the iron lock into place. The sounds of the jazz band and the murmuring guests were instantly cut off, leaving us in a cold, dimly lit room surrounded by thousands of bottles of expensive vintage wine. My father released me with a violent shove, forcing me to stumble back against a tall wooden wine rack. "You are going to fix this, Kendra," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are going to walk back out there. Confess to Desmond that you orchestrated this entire cyber attack out of petty jealousy, and you are going to give Jamal back every single cent you stole from his company." I straightened my tailored jacket, looking at the two people who were supposed to love and protect me. "Are you actually listening to yourselves?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "Jamal is a complete fraud. He forged that IP address to frame me because he has been embezzling from his own father. I did not take a single dime." "Stop lying," my mother shrieked, taking an aggressive step forward. "Jamal is a wealthy, respectable man. Why would he steal from his own family? You are just trying to ruin your sister's life because you have absolutely nothing of your own." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the glass bottles. "Ruin her life. Or stop paying for it. Because that is what this is really about. Is it not? You want me to take the fall and bail her out, just like you always do. Just like 15 years ago, when I found out my entire college savings account had been completely drained. I worked 3 jobs in high school to build that fund, and you emptied it without telling me so you could buy Chelsea a brand new luxury BMW for her 18th birthday. My father did not even have the decency to look ashamed of his past theft. He stepped closer, his face twisted in rage. Chelsea needed a reliable car to get to her university safely. You were going to a cheap local college anyway, so it did not matter. It was family money, and I made a decision, and right now I am making another one. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. Jamal had clearly prepared this in advance, anticipating that he would need a scapegoat before his father's auditors finally closed in on his trail. My father shoved the heavy stack of paperwork into my chest, forcing me to take it. "Jamal told us before dinner that if you return the money, he would not press federal charges," my father said coldly. "This is a full asset transfer agreement. You are going to sign over your entire auditing firm, all your liquid assets, and your private holdings directly to Jamal. It will cover the $5 million you stole, plus damages for the emotional distress you have caused your sister today." I stared down at the document, the sickening reality of the situation finally sinking in. My own flesh and blood. The people who raised me. They were completely willing to frame me for federal wire fraud, strip me of my entire life's work, and throw me into prison just to secure Chelsea's marriage to a billionaire family. They did not care about the truth or my innocence. They only cared about the immense wealth and status Jamal promised them. I looked directly at my mother. If I do not sign this, he will call the FBI. I said, testing her conscience one last time. I could go to federal prison for 20 years. Do you really want that for your own daughter? My mother looked at me with eyes as cold as ice. Then you should have thought about that before you messed with your sister's wedding. Sign the paper, Kendra. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my breathing to become shallow and ragged, forcing a look of absolute crushing defeat onto my face. I let a single highly convincing tear roll down my cheek. I pulled a silver pen from my pocket with a trembling hand. Fine, I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. You win. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the dotted line, legally transferring everything I owned to Jamal. My father immediately snatched the document from my hands, a triumphant, greedy smile spreading across his face. See? That was not so hard, my father sneered. Now stay in here until the dinner is over. You have caused enough embarrassment for one night. My parents turned their backs on me, unlocking the heavy door and stepping back out into the restaurant to deliver the good news to Jamal. The door clicked shut behind them, locking me inside. The moment I was entirely alone, the fake tears completely vanished from my eyes. My posture straightened, and a cold, deeply calculating smile curved on my lips. I raised my left wrist and tapped the digital screen of my smartwatch. The bait is set, I said clearly into the device. Track the signature ping. Sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the bridal suite at the sprawling luxury estate. It was the morning of the wedding, and the room was buzzing with the chaotic energy of makeup artists and hairstylists. Chelsea lounged luxuriously on a plush velvet sofa in the center of the room. She wore a custom white silk robe with the word bride meticulously embroidered in gold thread across the back. She held a crystal flute filled with an expensive mimosa, laughing loudly with two of her other bridesmaids while ignoring the makeup artist hovering over her face. The air in the suite was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hairspray. I stood quietly near the heavy mahogany door wearing the same drab gray bridesmaid dress from the night before, observing the scene with absolute detachment. Chelsea caught my reflection in the massive vanity mirror. Her laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a cruel, arrogant smirk. She waved her hand dismissively at the makeup artist and turned around on the sofa to face me directly. Kendra, do not just stand there taking up space, Chelsea commanded, her voice cutting sharply through the chatter in the room. The reception gown hanging in the corner has a terrible wrinkle right near the bottom hem. Grab the steamer and fix it immediately. And try not to ruin the delicate silk with your clumsy hands. I did not roll my eyes. I did not argue or defend myself. I simply walked across the thick Persian rug, picked up the heavy industrial steamer, and knelt onto the hardwood floor beside her extravagant second dress. I clicked the machine on and let the hot steam hiss gently against the expensive fabric. I maintained a perfect, unbroken facade of complete submission, playing the role of the defeated, humiliated older sister exactly as she expected. Chelsea took a long, arrogant sip of her mimosa and leaned forward, eager to twist the knife she thought she had firmly planted in my back the night before. I spoke to Jamal this morning, she announced loudly, ensuring the other bridesmaids were listening. He told me you finally stopped throwing your little tantrum and signed over your pathetic bookkeeping business to him to pay off your massive debt. Honestly, it is for the best, Kendra. You clearly have absolutely no idea how to manage real money if you have to resort to cyber theft. She laughed, a high, mocking sound that grated against my ears. Jamal is going to completely restructure your company from the ground up. Chelsea continued, gloating with every single word. He is going to liquidate your useless assets. Maybe if you are incredibly lucky and beg for my forgiveness, Jamal will let you keep a minimum wage position doing some basic data entry in a back office somewhere. You should be thanking him for being so generous after what you tried to pull. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the smooth white silk beneath my hands, making sure my tone was casually conversational. Jamal is certainly very confident in his financial restructuring plans, I said smoothly, moving the steamer down the length of the gown. I actually noticed on the legal transfer documents last night that he uses a very specific set of offshore routing numbers for his private holding accounts. They appeared to be heavily concentrated in the Cayman Islands. That is an incredibly complex banking structure for a man who is just absorbing a small bookkeeping business. Chelsea scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and looking at her friends as if I were the stupidest person alive. That is exactly why you failed at business. Kendra Chelsea bragged, her voice dripping with sheer condescension, because Jamal is an absolute financial genius. He explained his entire offshore strategy to me last night. He is aggressively moving his personal capital around to avoid the unnecessary corporate taxes that his father constantly mismanages. She took another sip of her drink, completely unaware of the legal trap she was currently sprinting into. Jamal says his Cayman accounts are perfectly secure and completely untraceable by regular federal banking standards, she boasted proudly. He is proactively protecting our future wealth from jealous, greedy people like you who try to drain his hard-earned money. You could never understand his level of brilliance. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from smiling. She was entirely clueless. On the morning of her wedding, she was proudly bragging about her future husband committing international wire fraud and tax evasion, openly admitting to his illegal offshore routing protocols in a room full of witnesses. She genuinely thought she was marrying a brilliant mastermind. Instead, she had just handed me the exact verbal confirmation my team needed to finalize the federal warrant. I stood up slowly and clicked the steamer off, hanging the nozzle back on its metal rack. Before I could offer Chelsea a response to her arrogant speech, my phone vibrated twice in the hidden pocket of my dress. I pulled the device out and quickly glanced at the glowing screen. It was a highly encrypted text message from the lead cyber technician at my auditing firm. The target scanned the physical contract. The text message read, "The honeypot software embedded directly inside your digital signature has successfully bypassed all of his security firewalls. We are completely inside Jamal's private Cayman servers right now. We have access to everything." I slipped my phone back into the hidden pocket of my gray dress, my expression remaining completely neutral despite the massive victory vibrating against my thigh. The trap was sprung. Before Chelsea could demand another mundane chore from me, the heavy mahogany door to the bridal suite swung open. My mother, Patricia, stepped into the room. She was fully dressed in a tailored emerald green gown that she had undoubtedly charged to the second mortgage on her house. Patricia clapped her hands sharply together, her face set in a rigid, authoritative scowl. "Everyone out," she ordered, waving her hand at the makeup artists, hairstylists, and the two other bridesmaids. "Give the bride some privacy. We have family business to attend to." The room cleared out rapidly, the door clicking shut behind the last departing stylist. We were completely alone. My mother did not waste a single second. She marched straight toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She reached into her expensive designer tote bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and shoved it directly into my chest. "Take it," Patricia snapped, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I caught the folder before it could fall to the floor. I opened the thick cover and began scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the crisp white pages. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steady. "It is a non-disclosure agreement and a formal family estrangement contract," my mother stated plainly, lifting her chin with an air of absolute superiority. "Your father and I had Jamal's lawyers drafted up early this morning. We are taking preventative measures, Kendra. Chelsea is marrying into the Desmond family empire today. She is going to be part of the elite high society. We cannot have a known cybercriminal and a bitter, jealous sibling dragging down her pristine reputation." Chelsea let out a dramatic sigh from the velvet sofa, examining her freshly painted fingernails. "It is honestly for your own good, Kendra," she chimed in, not even bothering to look up at me. "You clearly cannot handle being around my success. If people in Jamal's circle found out about what you tried to pull last night, it would be incredibly embarrassing for me. You are a massive liability to my new brand." I ignored my sister and kept reading the document. The terms were brutally clear. After the wedding reception concluded tonight, I was legally forbidden from ever contacting my parents or my sister again. I was not allowed to attend family holidays, funerals, or events. I was prohibited from speaking publicly about Jamal's finances or the circumstances surrounding my supposed asset transfer. They were systematically erasing me from their lives, confident that they had already extracted every ounce of financial value from my existence. But as my eyes scanned the third page, I stopped. I am a forensic auditor. I read incredibly complex financial documents for a living. And the high-priced lawyers Jamal had hired to rush this contract had made a catastrophic fatal error in their haste to protect him. I looked up at my mother, tapping the specific paragraph with my index finger. You do realize what this specific severance clause actually means, do you not? My mother rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, irritated breath. It means you take your pathetic little life and you stay away from us, Patricia sneered. It means we never have to look at your miserable face again. No, I corrected her calmly, keeping my tone perfectly even. It means an absolute total severance of all mutual financial and legal obligations. If I sign this, I am indemnified from any and all of your future liabilities. It means that if you and Dad default on that massive second mortgage you took out for this wedding, you cannot legally ask me for a single dime of support. It means I am entirely absolved of any filial responsibility. If your lives completely collapse, I am legally protected from the fallout. Patricia let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed terribly around the luxurious suite. Chelsea joined in, shaking her head at my supposed stupidity. You really are delusional, Kendra, my mother said, stepping closer and practically spitting the words at me. We are about to be intimately connected to a billionaire family. Jamal is going to take care of us for the rest of our lives. We will be flying on private jets and vacationing in the Mediterranean. We will never ever need a single cent from a pathetic failure like you. Just sign the paper and get out of our lives so we can finally be happy. I looked at my mother's cruel, arrogant face. I looked at my sister, who was smiling triumphantly on the sofa. They were handing me the ultimate shield on a silver platter. They thought they were throwing me away, but they were actually locking themselves inside a burning building and handing me the only key. I pulled the silver pen from my pocket. I did not shed a single tear. I did not argue or beg for their love. I placed the document against the vanity table, pressed the pen to the paper, and signed my name with a smooth, decisive stroke. I willingly and completely severed my legal ties to my parents, freeing myself entirely, just hours before the federal raid I had orchestrated came crashing down on all of their heads. I left the bridal suite without another word, stepping out into the sprawling, sunlit corridor of the estate. Downstairs, the muffled sounds of a string quartet warming up drifted through the air. The first wave of wedding guests was beginning to arrive, filling the grand foyer with the clinking of champagne glasses and polite high society chatter. Caterers rushed past, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres, and floral designers were frantically making final adjustments to the massive arches of white roses. The estate was a hive of chaotic activity, but I moved through the corridors with a singular quiet purpose. I needed to find Jamal. I spotted him standing at the end of a secluded oak-paneled hallway, far from the main reception area. He was admiring his reflection in a tall, antique mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine custom tuxedo. He looked every inch the billionaire heir he pretended to be, radiating an aura of complete invincibility. I took a deep breath, dropping my shoulders and letting my expression crumble into a mask of pure, absolute terror. I forced my breathing to become shallow and erratic, allowing my hands to tremble slightly as I approached him. "Jamal," I called out, keeping my voice soft and deliberately shaky. He turned around, his arrogant smile widening the moment he saw my defeated posture. "Well, if it is not my new favorite employee," Jamal sneered, casually slipping his hands into his tailored pockets. "Your mother just texted me. She said you signed the estrangement papers." I have to admit, Kendra, I am truly impressed. You finally learned your place in the food chain. "Please, Jamal," I pleaded, letting a desperate edge creep into my tone. I looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I signed the transfer papers last night. I gave you my entire company. I signed away my family today, just like you wanted. I have absolutely nothing left to my name." Just promise me you will not press federal charges. Please do not call the FBI. I cannot go to prison. I will do whatever you want. I will disappear completely. Just let me walk away from this." Jamal threw his head back and laughed a loud, cruel sound that echoed down the empty hallway. He stepped closer to me, his chest puffed out with sheer intoxicating hubris. He was completely drunk on his own perceived power, entirely unable to resist the overwhelming urge to brag to the woman he thought he had completely destroyed. "You really are pathetic," he whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive designer cologne radiating off his skin. "You actually thought you could walk into my world and try to expose me. You thought you could embarrass me in front of my father at my own rehearsal dinner and get away with it." I looked down at the floor, playing the perfectly broken victim. "I do not understand why you chose me," I whispered miserably, keeping my voice barely above a breath. "Why frame me for the $5 million? Jamal scoffed, shaking his head at my supposed ignorance. "Because you were the perfect, convenient idiot, Kendra. My father is ruthless and entirely paranoid. He initiated a massive internal audit of D Corp investments last week. He was going to find out the money was missing anyway. I needed a believable scapegoat immediately, and you handed yourself to me on a silver platter with your little family feud." He reached out and dismissively flicked the shoulder of my gray bridesmaid dress. "You see, being a billionaire's son does not actually mean you have unrestricted access to the billions. My father cut off my trust fund 2 years ago because he claimed I lacked discipline. So I made my own severance package. I diverted $5 million from the corporate employee pension fund into my private offshore accounts. I needed that money to buy Chelsea that massive 5-carat diamond ring she never shuts up about. I needed it to pay for my exotic cars, and I needed it to fund this ridiculous over-the-top wedding." Jamal grinned, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "When I realized I was about to get caught by the audit, I simply forged your home IP address on the transfer logs. It was incredibly easy. Who is my father going to believe his own flesh and blood, or a bitter, jealous sister who clearly has a vendetta against his future daughter-in-law? You took the bait, signed over your assets, and gave me the perfect cover story. I am going to liquidate your little firm on Monday to cover my tracks completely. You lost Kendra." I let his words hang in the air for a long, silent moment. I absorbed every single detail of his full, unprompted confession. Then very slowly I stopped trembling. The mask of the terrified, broken sister completely melted away, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp smile. I stood up straight, suddenly looking Jamal directly in the eyes, with a terrifying intensity that made him instinctively take a step back. I reached out toward his chest. He flinched, but I only lightly brushed my fingers against the lapel of his tuxedo. "What are you doing?" he demanded, a sudden flicker of genuine unease crossing his face. "Just fixing your suit, Jamal," I said smoothly. I adjusted the small, elegant diamond lapel pin resting on his jacket. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was also a high-grade military-level microtransmitter. I patted his chest softly. "I really appreciate your honesty, and I am entirely certain your father appreciates it too, considering this lapel pin has been broadcasting every single word you just said directly into his earpiece." Jamal stared down at the small diamond pin on his lapel. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a ghost. He reached up with trembling fingers, desperately trying to pull the transmitter off his jacket, but I did not stay to watch his panic attack. I turned on my heel and walked briskly down the hallway, leaving him gasping for air against the antique mirror. I pushed open a set of heavy glass French doors and stepped out into the sprawling manicured garden behind the estate. The cool morning air was a welcome relief from the suffocating toxic tension inside the house. I did not have to wait long. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched against the white gravel path directly behind me. I turned around to see Desmond approaching. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a man who had built an empire by absolutely crushing his enemies. His face was devoid of any visible emotion, but a dangerous, barely contained fury burned in his dark eyes. He stopped a few feet away from me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small wireless earpiece, and crushed it completely within the palm of his large hand. You knew Desmond stated his voice a low, rumbling threat that demanded absolute obedience. You knew he was the one draining my pension funds, and you orchestrated this entire morning just to get his confession on tape. I nodded slowly, maintaining direct eye contact with the furious billionaire. I am a forensic auditor, Desmond, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. I do not rely on guesses or assumptions. I rely on hard, undeniable evidence. Your son was foolish enough to think he could outsmart both of us. He thought he could use my family's toxic dynamics as a convenient smokescreen to hide his own massive financial crimes. I reached into the hidden compartment of my dress one more time and pulled out a slim encrypted tablet. I tapped the screen a few times, unlocking the dashboard of my auditing software, and handed the device to Desmond. He took it, his eyes quickly scanning the complex web of digital transactions glowing on the screen. The money he stole is currently sitting in a series of offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands, I explained calmly. As you can see, the software embedded in my signature last night bypassed his security protocols. I have full administrative access to his entire network. The funds are currently frozen. He cannot move a single cent. Desmond stared at the glowing screen, his breathing heavy and measured. He watched the digital confirmation of his own son's ultimate betrayal. For a man who valued loyalty and generational legacy above all else, this was the ultimate unforgivable insult. Jamal had not just stolen money from him. Jamal had stolen from the hardworking employees who built the foundation of his entire company. Desmond handed the tablet back to me, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, unforgiving stone. He is a disgrace to my family name, Desmond said quietly, the finality in his voice echoing like a judge delivering a death sentence. He has compromised my firm and insulted my intelligence. I want him entirely removed from my company, stripped of his remaining shares, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. I looked at the billionaire, feeling a strange, unspoken sense of kinship with him in that specific moment. We were both standing in the wreckage created by our own selfish, greedy families. Then we have a mutual goal, I replied smoothly. You want to purge the rot from your corporate empire, and I want my parents and sister to face the devastating reality of their own blinding greed. They sold me out for a criminal. They need to see exactly what they bought. Desmond adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, fully restoring his flawless billionaire composure. I have already made the call, he stated coldly, looking toward the estate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was alerted the moment your software confirmed the location of the stolen pension funds last night. They have a tactical unit parked exactly 2 miles down the main road waiting for my signal to move in and arrest him. I glanced toward the massive white tent being set up on the main lawn for the upcoming ceremony. The guests were already beginning to take their seats. Do not give the signal yet, I asked, my voice steady and cold. Wait until Chelsea walks down the aisle. Wait until they are standing right at the altar exchanging their vows. If my family wants a spectacular high society wedding, we should give them an audience they will never forget. Desmond gave a single curt nod, signaling his silent agreement. We parted ways in the garden, returning to the estate, just as the frantic wedding coordinator began herding the bridal party toward the historic stone chapel, situated at the edge of the property. The air was thick with the scent of imported white roses and the nervous excitement of 300 elite guests finding their seats. I took my place in line behind the other bridesmaids, keeping my face completely blank. The heavy wooden doors of the chapel stood closed at the end of the vestibule, muffling the majestic sounds of the string quartet playing inside. When the massive doors finally swung open for the bridal procession, a hush fell over the crowd. I stepped perfectly in time with the music, walking slowly down the long aisle lined with thousands of glowing candles. The chapel was a breathtaking display of unimaginable wealth, packed with Chicago high society powerful politicians and corporate titans. But my focus remained entirely on the 2 people sitting in the VIP front row, my parents. As I walked past them, my mother, Patricia, did not even try to hide her absolute contempt. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of pure disgust. She leaned over to my father, Richard, whispering something that made him chuckle darkly. They looked at me with the victorious, arrogant satisfaction of predators who had just successfully consumed their prey. They genuinely believed I was walking down this aisle as a completely broken woman. They thought I was penniless, legally estranged, and entirely at their mercy. I held my head high, offering them nothing but a serene, unbothered expression. At the end of the aisle, standing proudly at the altar, was Jamal. He had managed to compose himself after our encounter in the hallway. The panic I had seen in his eyes earlier was completely gone, replaced by his trademark blinding arrogance. He stood tall in his custom tuxedo, adjusting his cuffs, and looking out over the crowd of billionaires like a conquering king. He shot me a quick, condescending smirk as I took my place at the front, silently mocking my presence. He thought his father was completely in the dark. He thought he had outsmarted everyone in the room. Then the music swelled, transitioning into the traditional bridal march. The entire congregation rose to their feet. Chelsea made her grand entrance. She looked radiant, walking slowly down the aisle, with a massive veil trailing behind her. Her custom white silk gown sparkled under the warm lighting, and she carried a massive bouquet of rare orchids. She beamed at the guests, soaking in their admiration and envy. She looked directly at Jamal, her eyes shining with the greedy anticipation of officially securing her status in the billionaire class. When she finally reached the altar, my father handed her over to Jamal with a proud, emotional embrace, sealing the corrupt transaction. The priest, an elderly man with a soft, resonant voice, stepped up to the podium. He smiled warmly at the couple opening his leather-bound book. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Chelsea and Jamal." The priest began, his voice echoing perfectly through the quiet chapel. "Marriage is a sacred bond built on the absolute foundation of honesty, mutual respect, and unwavering trust. It is a promise to stand by one another completely bare of deception, honoring not just each other, but the families that have brought you to this very moment." The sheer irony of his words was almost suffocating. Honesty, trust, family bonds. Every single concept the priest mentioned had been brutally violated by the people standing right next to me. Jamal held Chelsea's hands, gazing into her eyes with a perfectly rehearsed look of deep devotion while wearing a wedding ring bought with stolen pension funds. My parents sat in the front row, dabbing away fake tears, having just forced their eldest daughter to sign a legal estrangement contract to protect their own financial interests. I stood quietly holding my small bouquet, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic anticipation. I glanced over at Desmond, who was seated in the front row opposite my parents. The billionaire patriarch sat perfectly still, his face carved from stone, his eyes fixed intensely on his son. The priest turned the page of his book, raising his voice slightly to address the entire congregation. "If there is anyone present who knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," the priest asked, his voice ringing clearly into the silent, candlelit room, "speak now or forever hold your peace." A perfectly polite silence fell over the chapel. Chelsea smiled confidently at Jamal, knowing nobody would dare interrupt her perfect day. But before the priest could take his next breath to continue the ceremony, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel were violently thrown open, crashing loudly against the stone walls. 4 men dressed in dark tactical suits with the bold yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their heavy combat vests marched into the sanctuary. Their boots thudded violently against the pristine marble floor, shattering the sacred quiet of the ceremony. The sudden intrusion sent an immediate shockwave of sheer panic through the pews. The string quartet, startled out of their polished professionalism, let out a terrible screeching dissonance as the lead cellist dropped his bow. The bridal march died instantly, replaced by a rising chorus of gasps, panicked murmurs, and the frantic rustling of expensive silk as 300 elite guests turned in their seats to witness the unbelievable spectacle unfolding behind them. These were not local police officers making a polite inquiry. These were federal agents executing a high-level corporate raid, moving with terrifying, calculated precision. They did not pause to answer the confused, indignant questions of the billionaire guests. They did not care about the sea of designer gowns or the custom floral arrangements they ruthlessly brushed past. Their eyes were locked dead ahead, fixed entirely on the altar. Chelsea let out a sharp, terrified shriek, instinctively taking a step back and clutching her massive bouquet of rare white orchids to her chest like a protective shield. Her perfect, glowing smile vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute horror as she stared at the armed men storming her perfect wedding. She looked frantically at Jamal, waiting for him to use his immense wealth and power to throw the men out. But Jamal was completely paralyzed. The arrogant king from just moments ago had instantly crumbled into a pale, sweating, trembling mess. His eyes darted wildly around the chapel, silently searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. He was trapped. In the front row, the chaotic reality of the situation finally registered in my mother's brain. However blinded by her unwavering belief in Jamal's lies from the night before, Patricia assumed the federal agents were there for a completely different reason. She assumed they were there to arrest me. The overwhelming emotional validation, combined with the sheer public spectacle of the raid, was simply too much for her fragile image-obsessed nerves. Patricia let out a dramatic gasp, threw her manicured hand over her forehead, and collapsed backward into her wooden pew in a dead faint. Several wealthy guests sitting nearby rushed to fan her face, adding to the swirling, embarrassing chaos of the chapel. My father, Richard, did not swoon. He jumped to his feet, his face turning a vibrant shade of red with a mix of fury and triumphant vindication. He stepped out into the center aisle, puffing out his chest and directly blocking the path of the advancing agents. He raised his arm, pointing a thick, aggressive finger straight past them and directly at me where I stood quietly near the altar. "It is about time you got here," my father bellowed, his loud voice echoing aggressively over the panicked murmurs of the elite crowd. He looked around at the wealthy guests, making sure everyone heard his heroic denunciation of his own daughter. "That woman standing right there is the criminal you are looking for. Arrest her immediately. She is a corporate spy and a vicious cyber thief. She stole $5 million from D Corp Investments and tried to frame an innocent man just to ruin this beautiful wedding out of pure jealousy. Do your jobs and put her in handcuffs right now before she tries to run away." The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from absolute stone, did not even break his stride. He simply shoved his heavy shoulder into my father's chest, violently pushing Richard out of the way and sending him stumbling awkwardly back into the wooden pews. "Move out of the way, sir," the agent barked coldly, completely ignoring my father's frantic accusations. The agents reached the altar. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in front of me, watching the inevitable destruction finally unfold. Jamal opened his mouth, raising his shaking hands in a weak defensive gesture, perhaps preparing to utter one final desperate lie to save his reputation. But the lead agent did not give him the chance to speak a single word. He bypassed me entirely, not even glancing in my direction. He stepped right onto the elevated platform, grabbed Jamal roughly by the shoulders, and forcibly spun the groom around. Chelsea screamed again, dropping her expensive bouquet to the floor as the agent forcefully yanked Jamal's arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent chapel sounded sweeter than any wedding bell ever could. The lead agent leaned in, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room with absolute authority. "Jamal, you are under federal arrest for international wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and felony money laundering." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Jamal's wrists, sealing his fate with a sharp metallic finality. But before the lead agent could even begin to read him his rights, Chelsea completely snapped. The initial shock that had frozen her to the spot instantly evaporated, replaced by a blinding, irrational rage. She lunged forward, her pristine custom white gown tangling awkwardly around her legs as she threw herself at the federal agents. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted stone ceiling of the chapel. "Let him go right now. Do you have any idea who he is? Do you have any idea how much this wedding costs? You are ruining my perfect day. Get out of my church immediately." The lead agent did not even flinch. He casually extended a single thick arm, physically blocking Chelsea from interfering with the arrest. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you step back," he warned, his tone flat and utterly devoid of any sympathy for the screaming bride. "If you lay another hand on a federal officer, you will be leaving this chapel in handcuffs right next to your groom." The blunt threat of arrest finally forced Chelsea to recoil, her face twisting in indignant fury, but her distraction gave Jamal the split second he needed to regain his voice. Even with his arms pinned firmly behind his back, his legendary arrogance flared up one last time. He twisted his head, locking his panicked eyes on the lead agent, and launched into a desperate, chaotic tirade of gaslighting. "You are making a massive mistake!" Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with artificial outrage. "I am the victim here. I did not steal a single dime from my father's company. If you want the real cybercriminal, you need to arrest her." He aggressively thrust his chin toward me. "Kendra orchestrated this entire raid," he yelled, making sure his voice carried to the back pews. "She hacked into my private servers to frame me because she is insanely jealous of my wife. She has been trying to destroy this wedding from day one." From the front row, my father jumped on the opportunity to support the billionaire heir. "He is telling the absolute truth," Richard bellowed, pointing an accusing finger at me while waving his other hand frantically at the FBI. "She is a completely unhinged woman. She has been trying to destroy this family for years. You have the wrong person. Arrest my daughter." Jamal seized on my father's vocal defense, his eyes widening with frantic, desperate hope. "I have the physical proof," Jamal insisted, pulling away from the agent's iron grip. "Check the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I have legally binding transfer documents. She signed them just last night. She officially transferred her entire auditing company and all of her personal assets to me as a full repayment for the $5 million she stole." Why would a supposedly innocent woman sign over her entire life savings? Read the documents. They are a signed confession. The lead agent raised a highly skeptical eyebrow. He reached into Jamal's tailored jacket pocket and pulled out the thick, neatly folded stack of legal papers my father had forced me to sign in the wine cellar the night before. The agent flipped open the heavy cover, his eyes quickly scanning the dense legal jargon, and my clear signature located right at the bottom of the final page. "See?" Jamal gloated, a sickening, triumphant smile breaking through his overwhelming panic as he looked out at the stunned congregation. "It is right there in black and white. She completely admitted to the theft. She transferred the money back to my private accounts to avoid prosecution. You need to take these cuffs off me and put them on her right now." A wave of loud whispers erupted across the chapel. The elite guests murmured among themselves, clearly swayed by Jamal's confident lie and the physical presence of a signed legal document. Chelsea crossed her arms, shooting me a look of pure venomous victory. I stood quietly at the edge of the altar, letting Jamal dig his own grave as deep as physically possible. I let the entire congregation of wealthy guests hear his desperate, calculated lies. I let my own father publicly double down on his devastating betrayal. Then I slowly reached into the hidden pocket of my gray bridesmaid dress. I did not pull out a desperate plea for innocence. I pulled out a small, sleek black remote control. I walked calmly up the carpeted steps of the altar, completely ignoring the armed federal agents and my glaring sister. I approached the wooden podium where the priest stood, frozen in absolute shock. I bypassed him entirely and plugged a small wireless receiver directly into the chapel's state-of-the-art audiovisual system, which had been set up earlier to project a romantic photo montage of the couple after their vows. I turned around to face the crowd, holding the remote high in the air. "Let us check those documents together, Jamal," I said, my voice completely steady and echoing loudly through the chapel speakers. I pressed a single button on the remote control. The chapel lights instantly dimmed to a soft glow, and the massive ceiling-mounted projector hummed to life. But instead of a romantic photo montage of the happy couple set to acoustic music, a blindingly bright presentation of complex financial logs, offshore banking statements, and encrypted routing codes splashed across the 50-foot vaulted stone wall directly behind the altar. The towering numbers and bright red graphs bathed the stunned faces of the congregation in a harsh digital light. I turned to face the 300 elite guests gripping the wooden podium with absolute authority. For those of you who only know me through my family's rather colorful and insulting descriptions, Allow me to formally introduce myself, I said, my voice echoing evenly over the sound system. I am a senior forensic auditor and an anonymous asset recovery specialist. I hunt down stolen corporate capital for a living. And last night, in a locked wine cellar, I was forced to sign over my entire firm to the man currently standing in handcuffs. Jamal thrashed against the heavy grip of the federal agents, his eyes darting frantically toward the massive projection on the wall. "Turn that off!" he screamed, his voice breaking with sheer terror. "You have absolutely no right to show my private information. It is completely illegal." "What is truly illegal, Jamal, is forging an IP address to frame an innocent woman for your own massive corporate embezzlement," I replied smoothly, clicking to the next slide. I pointed toward the screen, where the high-resolution image of the transfer document my father had forced me to sign appeared. I want to explain a concept to everyone in this room. It is called a honeypot signature. When Jamal took this signed contract back to his hotel room last night and scanned it into his private computer network, he unknowingly downloaded a highly aggressive forensic extraction tool embedded directly inside the digital ink. A collective gasp swept through the pews. Whispers of shock and admiration rippled through the crowd of corporate titans. I clicked the remote again, and the massive screen transitioned to a detailed timeline of Jamal's personal banking history. The extraction tool bypassed every single one of his expensive firewalls. In less than 3 seconds, I continued pacing slowly across the altar. It gave my team unrestricted administrative access to his entire financial portfolio. And the reality of that portfolio is absolutely devastating. I looked directly at Chelsea. Her face was completely drained of blood. She was staring at the wall, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. "Jamal is not a billionaire, Chelsea," I stated plainly, making sure the entire room heard the finality in my voice. "He is not a financial genius moving capital to avoid corporate taxes. The truth is, Desmond cut off his trust fund entirely 2 years ago because of his reckless spending. For the past 36 months, Jamal has been completely and utterly broke." The projection highlighted a series of massive debts, maxed-out credit lines, and defaulted luxury car loans. "He was drowning in debt," I explained, gesturing to the staggering negative balances illuminated in bright red. But he refused to give up his playboy lifestyle. He needed to keep up appearances. He needed to buy expensive suits, rent private jets, and throw lavish parties to convince high society that he was still the golden heir to the D-Corp empire. So he found a new source of income. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen shifted to a massive, undeniable wire transfer log. It showed exactly $5 million moving from D-Corp investments directly into Jamal's hidden Cayman Island accounts. "He stole $5 million from his own father's company," I announced, my voice ringing with righteous fury. "But he did not steal from the corporate profit margins. He bypassed the main accounts entirely." I pointed the remote directly at the screen, zooming in on one specific, highly detailed transaction receipt. I turned my gaze back to my sister, who was visibly trembling, clutching the side of her expensive white gown as if she might collapse. "Look at the screen, Chelsea," I demanded. "Look at the exact origin of the funds used to purchase that massive 5-carat diamond ring currently sitting on your left hand. It was not bought with Jamal's generational wealth. It was purchased using the stolen pension funds of D-Corp's blue-collar workers. Your beautiful diamond was bought with the retirement money of janitors, factory workers, and administrative assistants. The people who spent their entire lives building that company had their futures wiped out just so you could parade around in high society wearing a stolen rock. You thought you were marrying royalty, but you are legally binding yourself to a desperate thief." The heavy silence that followed my declaration was shattered by the slow, deliberate sound of leather shoes striking the stone floor. Desmond, the billionaire patriarch of the D-Corp empire, stepped out of the front pew. He did not rush. He moved with the terrifying, inevitable momentum of a massive storm making landfall. He walked up the carpeted steps of the altar, his presence so overwhelmingly commanding that even the armed federal agents respectfully stepped back to give him space. He stood directly beside me, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the center of the sanctuary. Jamal looked up at his father, his eyes wide with absolute panic. His legs finally gave out entirely. The arrogant groom collapsed heavily onto his knees right there on the altar, his custom tuxedo wrinkling awkwardly against the polished wood. "Dad, please." Jamal sobbed, his voice cracking as he completely abandoned any remaining shred of his pride. "You have to listen to me. I did not want to do this. I swear to you it was her." He twisted his body as much as the steel handcuffs would allow, pointing a shaking finger directly at Chelsea. My sister let out a shrill, horrified gasp of absolute betrayal, taking a sudden step backward. "She completely manipulated me." Jamal cried out, his voice echoing pathetically through the vaulted chapel. "She demanded the massive 5-carat ring. She demanded the $1 million wedding and the private jets. She threatened to leave me and publicly humiliate our family if I did not provide the lavish lifestyle she believed she deserved. I only took the money because she forced me into an impossible corner. You have to believe me, Dad. I am your son. Protect me. Please do not let them take me away." Desmond stared down at the weeping man kneeling before him. There was no paternal warmth left in his dark eyes, no flicker of forgiveness or sympathy. There was only the cold, calculating gaze of a corporate titan observing a catastrophically failed investment. "You are not a victim," Jamal Desmond said, his voice ringing through the silent chapel with terrifying clarity. "You are a weak, greedy coward. You stole from the people who trusted me. You stole from the people who built my company with their sweat, their blood, and their unwavering loyalty. You compromised my entire generational legacy for a shiny piece of jewelry and a wildly fragile ego." Desmond straightened his posture, looking down at his son with absolute finality. "You are no longer my son." Desmond declared, his words hitting like physical blows. "From this exact moment forward, you are completely disowned. You are officially stripped of the family name. You will never see a single cent of my wealth. You will never step foot inside my corporate offices, and you will never contact me again for the rest of your miserable life." Jamal let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair, dropping his head and burying his face against the floorboards of the altar. Desmond did not even flinch at the sound of his son's destruction. He turned his attention directly to the lead federal agent standing guard over the broken groom. Agent Desmond stated firmly, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine suit. "I am the founder and majority shareholder of D Corp Investments. I am officially confirming right now in front of all these witnesses that the corporation is pressing full criminal and civil charges against this man." The federal agent gave a single respectful nod. "I want every single stolen asset completely recovered." Desmond continued, his tone devoid of any mercy. "And I want him prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent of federal law. Do not offer him a plea deal. Do not negotiate a reduced sentence. I want him sitting in a federal penitentiary for a very long time." The lead agent hauled a loudly sobbing Jamal back to his feet, preparing to march him out of the chapel. The sheer magnitude of the destruction was finally settling over the room. Chelsea was hyperventilating near the podium, staring blankly at the empty space where her billionaire future had just violently evaporated. But Desmond was not finished. He slowly turned his head, his piercing gaze locking directly onto the front row, where my parents were currently cowering in sheer terror. Richard had sunk incredibly low in his wooden seat, all his previous aggressive bluster completely gone. Patricia had awoken from her dramatic fainting spell, trembling violently as she clutched the fabric of her expensive green gown. Desmond stepped down from the altar, closing the distance between himself and my terrified parents with slow, deliberate steps. He stood towering over them, radiating an aura of pure, unadulterated menace. He looked at Richard and Patricia with a level of intense disgust that words could barely capture. "And as for you two, you aided and abetted a felon." Desmond's words hung heavily in the air, echoing with the terrible weight of a federal indictment. My father's jaw dropped, his face draining of all the color and aggressive bluster he had so proudly worn just moments before. He looked from Desmond's unforgiving glare to the federal agents standing at the altar, finally comprehending the catastrophic reality of the situation. The billionaire safety net they had sacrificed everything to secure was completely gone. Jamal was not a wealthy heir who could elevate them into high society. He was a penniless criminal headed straight for a federal penitentiary, and my parents were standing in the blast radius of his massive fraud. The sheer panic that overtook them was instantaneous and violently pathetic. Survival instincts kicked in, completely overriding whatever twisted loyalty they felt toward their golden child's fiancé. Richard leaped to his feet, throwing his hands up in a frantic gesture of surrender. We had absolutely no idea, my father practically screamed, taking a desperate step backward, as if trying to physically distance himself from Jamal. We are completely innocent. He lied to us. He manipulated our entire family. We would never willingly participate in corporate fraud. Patricia was right behind him, her voice trembling as she frantically nodded in agreement. "We thought he was a respectable man," she cried out, clutching her emerald gown. "He preyed on our trust. He forced our daughter into a corner. We are victims here, Desmond. You have to believe us." Jamal turned his head, looking at my parents with wide, betrayed eyes. "You helped me frame her," he yelled, struggling against the federal agents holding him down. "You forced her to sign those transfer papers in the wine cellar. You knew exactly what you were doing. Shut your mouth, you lying thief!" Richard bellowed back, completely abandoning the man he had been vigorously defending just 5 minutes ago. "You used my family. You deserve to rot in a prison cell for what you did to us." Having completely thrown Jamal under the bus, my parents frantically calculated their next move. Their eyes darted around the room, landing squarely on the only person who possessed the wealth, power, and undeniable evidence to save them from total ruin. They looked at me. Instantly, the venomous hatred they had projected at me for my entire life vanished, replaced by a sickening, rehearsed display of maternal and paternal affection. Patricia burst into loud theatrical tears. She pushed past the stunned guests in the front row and practically sprinted up the carpeted steps of the altar, with Richard following closely on her heels. "Kendra, my darling girl," my mother sobbed, her arms outstretched as she rushed toward me, aiming for a tight, emotional embrace. "Thank God you figured it out. Thank God you are so incredibly brilliant." I took a sharp step backward, raising my hand to stop her. She stumbled, her arms dropping awkwardly to her sides, shocked that I was not eagerly accepting her display of fake love. "We knew he was lying the entire time, Kendra," my father chimed in, his voice thick with fake, desperate emotion. "We saw right through his arrogant facade last night. We just played along to catch him. We knew if we pressured you, he would get completely overconfident and make a fatal mistake. We were protecting you, sweetheart. We were acting as your undercover allies to ensure this terrible man was brought to justice." The sheer audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. They were standing in a chapel filled with hundreds of people, surrounded by federal agents, attempting to gaslight me into believing that their brutal emotional abuse and legal extortion was actually a secret master plan born out of parental love. They expected me to simply fold to accept their blatant manipulation. They wanted me to use my vast resources to shield them from severe legal consequences. I looked at my mother's tear-stained face. I looked at my father's pleading eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, only a profound, liberating emptiness where my desperate need for their approval used to live. "You really are remarkable," I said, my voice cold and flat, cutting right through their pathetic performance. "You will say absolutely anything to survive. But your performance is completely over." I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress. I pulled out the thick, legally binding manila folder my mother had shoved into my chest in the bridal suite just a few hours earlier. I held the document up high, letting the bright light of the projector catch the crisp white paper. "You did not play along," I stated firmly. "You legally disowned me 3 hours ago. We are no longer family." My parents stared at the estrangement document in absolute horror. The color completely drained from their faces as the reality of their own boundless greed finally trapped them. They had willingly severed their only remaining lifeline. But before they could even attempt to formulate another pathetic excuse, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered the remaining silence in the chapel. I turned my head to see Chelsea completely losing her mind. The sheer gravity of her ruined future had finally penetrated her thick skull. She was not marrying into a billionaire dynasty. She was not going to be a high society socialite flying on private jets and attending exclusive charity galas. She was legally tying herself to a broke, disgraced felon who was about to spend the best years of his life in a federal prison cell. Chelsea grabbed the delicate diamond-encrusted tiara, holding her massive silk veil in place, and violently ripped it off her head. The expensive pins tore at her perfectly styled blonde hair, but she did not care. She threw the heavy veil directly onto the floor, stomping on the imported lace with the heel of her designer shoe. "You lied to me!" Chelsea shrieked, her voice cracking with an unhinged feral rage. She lunged at Jamal completely, ignoring the armed federal agent standing right next to him. "You told me you had endless offshore accounts. You told me your father was just jealous of your financial genius. You are nothing but a pathetic, broke criminal." Before the federal agents could pull her back, Chelsea raised her hand and slapped Jamal across the face with all the strength she could muster. The sharp, resounding crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed violently through the vaulted stone sanctuary. Jamal flinched, his head snapping to the side, but he did not say a single word. He just stared at the floor, utterly defeated. The lead agent quickly stepped between them, firmly pushing Chelsea back by her shoulders to prevent another physical assault. "Compose yourself immediately," the agent ordered, his voice echoing with stern authority. But Chelsea was completely beyond reason. Breathing heavily, her face streaked with ruined, expensive makeup, she spun around and locked her manicured sights directly on me. She stomped up the carpeted steps of the altar, her eyes burning with a toxic, delusional sense of entitlement that had been nurtured by our parents for her entire life. "You have to fix this right now, Kendra," Chelsea demanded, pointing an aggressively trembling finger in my face. "You are sitting on millions of dollars. You have an entire auditing empire. You need to write a check and pay Desmond back immediately. You need to bail Jamal out so we can proceed with this wedding." I looked at her, completely baffled by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. "I am not paying a single cent to bail out the man who tried to frame me for federal wire fraud," I replied smoothly. "Your wedding is completely over, Chelsea." "You owe me!" Chelsea screamed, her voice reaching a pitch so high it actually hurt my ears. "You have always owed me. I am the younger, prettier sister. I am the one who was supposed to be successful and famous. I was supposed to have the lavish lifestyle, not you. You are just a boring, plain bookkeeper. You do not deserve any of that wealth. You need to give it to me. It is my special day and you are completely ruining it. If you do not bail him out, then you have to fund my lifestyle yourself. I am not going back to being normal. I refuse." She was literally throwing a temper tantrum on a church altar in front of 300 horrified guests and a squad of federal agents. It was the most pathetic display of spoiled narcissism I had ever witnessed. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her exhaust her own chaotic energy, watching her self-destruct in real time. "You built your entire identity on the money of a man who was stealing from blue-collar workers," I stated coldly. "You do not deserve a lavish lifestyle, Chelsea. You deserve exactly what you have right now, which is absolutely nothing." Chelsea let out another hysterical scream, preparing to launch herself at me, just like she had attacked Jamal. But before she could take a single step forward, the lead federal agent stepped directly into her path, completely blocking her advance. "Excuse me, ma'am," the lead agent said, his deep voice instantly cutting through her frantic screaming. Chelsea glared at him, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "What do you want?" she snapped disrespectfully. "Are you going to arrest me too? I am the victim here." The agent looked her up and down with an expression of sheer professional detachment. "No, ma'am. We are not arresting you today," the agent replied calmly. "But according to the financial logs currently projected on that wall, the custom $100,000 wedding dress you are currently wearing was purchased directly using the stolen corporate pension funds." Chelsea froze, her eyes widening in absolute terror. "That makes your gown illegally obtained merchandise." The agent continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. It is officially classified as federal evidence in a major corporate embezzlement case. I'm going to need you to take the dress off immediately. Chelsea stood completely frozen, her jaw trembling as the agent's command registered. Take it off, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising clamor. You cannot be serious. It is my wedding dress. The agent did not offer a shred of sympathy. He gestured toward a small door just off the altar. I am completely serious, ma'am, he replied, his tone hard as steel. You have 5 minutes to step into that side room and find a substitute garment. If you refuse to comply, you will be obstructing a federal investigation and I will arrest you right here. Chelsea let out a broken sob. She gathered the heavy silk of her gown and rushed off the altar, disappearing into the side room. The illusion of her perfect billionaire wedding was completely shattered. The sanctuary descended into absolute chaos. Elite guests, realizing they were sitting inside a massive federal crime scene, began murmuring frantically and scrambling toward the exits. But the FBI was already 2 steps ahead. More agents poured into the chapel and spread across the estate grounds. Through the stained glass windows, I watched tactical teams systematically moving through the sprawling outdoor reception tent. They were slapping bright red federal seizure tags on everything in sight. The champagne fountains, catering equipment, floral centerpieces, and rented luxury vehicles were all locked down as evidence purchased with stolen corporate pension funds. My father saw the red tags being plastered across the estate and panicked. Richard was a coward at heart. Realizing the ship was sinking, he decided to cut his losses and run. He dropped his gaze to the floor, slipped out of the front pew, and tried to briskly walk down the side aisle toward the chapel vestibule. He clutched his car keys tightly, hoping to quietly escape the humiliation, drive away, and regroup at home where it was safe. As Richard reached for the heavy brass handle of the chapel door, a burly federal agent stepped out from the shadows, firmly planting himself in the exit path. Richard collided with the agent's chest, stumbling backward in shock. "Excuse me," my father stammered, putting on a brave, indignant face. "I am the father of the bride. This has been a traumatic morning for my family. I am simply going out to my car to retrieve my wife's medication. Step aside and let me pass." I walked slowly down the center aisle, leaving the ruined altar behind. I approached the vestibule, stopping just a few feet away from my sweating, frantic father. "You are not going anywhere, Richard," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the crowd. My father spun around, glaring at me with the last ounces of his shattered pride. "You have done enough damage, Kendra," he hissed, his face turning bright red. "You humiliated your sister. You sent her groom to prison. You proved your point. Now call off these agents and let your mother and me go home in peace." I shook my head slowly, looking at him with absolute pity. "That is the problem with your boundless greed, Richard," I replied smoothly. "You always think you are the smartest person in the room." But when I audited Jamal's offshore accounts last night, I did not just find his massive debts and the stolen pension funds. I found the deposits. I found the initial capital used to secure this luxury estate before Jamal could access his stolen money. Richard instantly went rigid. The car keys slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. "You did not just stand by and let Jamal steal," I continued, making sure my mother, who had just rushed up behind him, heard every single word. "Jamal was strapped for cash last month, and you wanted this high society wedding to happen at any cost. So without telling anyone, you secretly took out a massive short-term loan against your own house. You gave Jamal hundreds of thousands of dollars for the deposits, fully expecting him to pay you back double from his fake billionaire trust fund once the marriage was finalized." My mother gasped, grabbing his arm. "Tell me, she is lying," Patricia pleaded in panic. "Tell me you did not mortgage our home for this." Richard could not speak. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with absolute dread. "Jamal mixed your loan directly with the stolen corporate funds to pay the vendors," I explained coldly, delivering the crushing blow. "Under federal asset forfeiture laws, any property used to facilitate money laundering or secure illicit funds is subject to immediate seizure. Because your loan was tied directly to his stolen money, the federal government is not just taking the wedding cake today, they are seizing your house." My mother let out a horrific high-pitched scream, burying her face into Richard's chest. as the sheer magnitude of their financial ruin finally crashed down upon them. My father's knees practically buckled, his large frame sagging as he realized that his reckless, greedy gamble had just cost him everything he had spent his entire life building. They stumbled backward, retreating from the chapel vestibule and staggering out onto the wide stone steps leading down to the estate's driveway, gasping for air like fish thrown onto dry land. I followed them slowly, stepping out into the cool morning breeze. The sprawling lawn was now entirely overrun with federal agents meticulously logging every single piece of expensive wedding equipment. The flashing red and blue lights of the FBI cruisers parked along the circular driveway cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over the manicured hedges. "Kendra," my father gasped, his chest heaving as he turned to face me. "You have to stop this. You are a powerful auditor. You work with these people. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them we had no idea the money was stolen. They cannot take our house. It is everything we have. Where are we supposed to live?" Patricia broke away from Richard and rushed toward me, falling heavily onto her knees, right there on the hard stone steps. The emerald fabric of her designer gown pooled around her like a deflated balloon. She reached out her hands, trembling violently as she tried to grab the hem of my gray bridesmaid dress. "Please, Kendra," my mother wailed, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "We are your parents. We gave you life. You cannot just stand there and watch us become completely homeless. You have millions of dollars sitting in your accounts. You can write a check right now and pay off the loan. You can buy the house back from the government. Blood is thicker than water, Kendra. Family takes care of family in times of crisis. You have to save us." I stepped back, ensuring her frantic hands could not touch my clothing. I looked down at the two people who had spent the last 33 years systematically dismantling my self-worth to build up their golden child. I did not feel an ounce of the guilt they were so desperately trying to weaponize against me. I felt only the cold, sharp clarity of absolute justice. "Blood is thicker than water," I repeated slowly, letting the tired, manipulative cliché hang in the air. "That is a fascinating concept coming from you, Patricia. Where was that philosophy last night when you shoved a legal contract into my hands and demanded I surrender my entire life's work to a criminal just to protect your social climbing ambitions? Where was that unconditional family loyalty when you literally forced me to sign a document completely severing our legal ties so I would not embarrass Chelsea in front of her billionaire in-laws?" Richard opened his mouth to interrupt, perhaps to offer another pathetic excuse, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly with a single furious glare. "You do not get to speak, Richard," I commanded, my voice slicing through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "You made your choice. You have always made your choice. For my entire life, you looked right past me. You took the college fund I worked 3 jobs to build and handed it to Chelsea for a luxury car. You allowed her to openly humiliate me at every single family gathering. And today, when you thought I was a broke cybercriminal, you gladly threw me to the wolves. You literally cheered when you thought the FBI was going to arrest me." I stepped closer to them, my voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that carried more weight than any scream ever could. "You did not want a daughter. You wanted a sacrificial lamb. You wanted a scapegoat you could continuously bleed dry to fund Chelsea's narcissistic delusions. And now you get to live with the exact consequences of your own bottomless greed. You mortgaged your own future on a thief, and you lost the bet. I am not saving you. I am not writing a check. You are going to lose that house, and you are going to face the complete public humiliation you have so desperately tried to avoid." Patricia sobbed loudly, collapsing completely against the stone steps, her shoulders shaking violently. Richard just stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow, finally understanding that his lifelong emotional manipulation had lost all of its power. I reached into the small silk clutch purse I had carried down the aisle. I pulled out a small rectangular piece of plastic. I tossed it lightly, letting it clatter against the stone steps right in front of my weeping mother. "That is the $50 Uber gift card you mailed me for my birthday last year," I said smoothly, turning my back on them and preparing to walk away from my toxic family forever. Use it to get a ride to a cheap motel, because you are not going home today. I turned my back on them and walked away. The sound of my mother's hysterical sobbing fading into the background of the chaotic estate. Near the circular driveway, the federal agents were finally loading Jamal into the back of a heavily armored FBI cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his face, highlighting the absolute despair etched into his features. He looked completely unrecognizable. The custom-tailored tuxedo was rumpled, the expensive fabric stained with sweat and dirt from his collapse on the altar. His shoulders were slumped forward, his head bowed in absolute defeat as the heavy car door slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside a steel cage. There was no arrogant billionaire heir left. There was only a broken thief being carted away to face federal justice. As the cruiser's engine roared to life and its sirens briefly flashed, pulling away down the long tree-lined driveway, a tall shadow fell across the manicured lawn beside me. I turned to see Desmond. The billionaire patriarch had left the chaotic sanctuary and was standing quietly near the edge of the rose garden. He had clearly watched the entire devastating exchange between my parents and me on the stone steps. He did not look angry or distressed by the catastrophic collapse of his son's wedding or the massive federal raid seizing his property. Instead, he looked at me with an expression of profound calculating respect. "You handled that with remarkable precision," Desmond said, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise of the federal agents tagging evidence all around us. Most people would have let their emotions dictate their actions. They would have gloated or screamed or sought some kind of petty, messy revenge. But you did not. You were completely ruthless. You executed a flawless extraction, exposed a massive corporate vulnerability, and surgically removed the toxic elements from both of our lives without a single trace of hesitation. You used my son's arrogance as a weapon against him, and it worked perfectly. "I am an auditor, Desmond," I replied, keeping my posture straight and my tone perfectly professional. "I identify the liabilities, I expose the fraud, and I close the accounts. It is simply what I do. I do not let sentimentality cloud the data." Desmond nodded slowly, clasping his hands behind his back. "My company just suffered a catastrophic internal security failure," he stated bluntly, the ruthless businessman in him fully taking over. "My own son managed to siphon $5 million right under the noses of my senior financial officers. My current compliance department is clearly incompetent. They are weak, easily manipulated, and entirely useless to me. I need someone who operates exactly the way you do. Someone who cannot be bought, manipulated, or intimidated by a famous last name or a false display of power." He stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine with intense seriousness. "I am formally offering you the position of Chief Compliance Officer at D Corp Investments. It comes with a $10 million annual contract, full executive authority over all internal financial audits, and a direct reporting line exclusively to me. You will have the power to restructure my entire corporate security apparatus globally. You will be one of the most powerful women in the financial sector." I stood quietly on the lawn, letting the sheer magnitude of his offer completely sink in. A $10 million annual contract was an astronomical leap, even for a highly successful independent auditor like myself. But it was not just about the massive influx of money. It was about the immense, unassailable power that came with holding the keys to a global billionaire empire. For my entire life, my family had treated me like a lowly paper pusher, a worthless disappointment they had to hide from polite society. Now a titan of industry was handing me the sword and shield to defend his entire legacy. "I accept your offer, Desmond," I said smoothly, extending my hand toward him without a shred of hesitation. "But I have one non-negotiable condition before I sign the executive contract." Desmond raised a silver eyebrow, clearly intrigued by a woman who had the nerve to negotiate terms with him just moments after orchestrating a federal raid. "Name it," he replied simply. I turned my head slightly, glancing back toward the chapel steps, where my father was currently arguing frantically with a federal agent over the impending seizure of his vehicle. Richard is a massive financial liability who willingly participated in a federal crime to fund his own superficial lifestyle, I explained coldly. I want his name, his social security number, and his remaining business entities permanently blacklisted from every single banking network, lending institution, and corporate credit line affiliated with D Corp Investments. Desmond followed my gaze, looking at the pathetic man sweating on the church steps. Consider it done, Desmond agreed, instantly shaking my hand. Desmond offered a curt nod, sealing the agreement. I left him standing by the garden and walked back toward the stone chapel, moving against the flow of the remaining guests, who were hurriedly fleeing the estate. I bypassed the main sanctuary entirely and headed straight for the small, quiet rectory located at the back of the building. My heavy, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit was still hanging neatly inside its protective garment bag, right where I had hidden it earlier that morning. I stepped into the small, private room and locked the wooden door behind me. I reached behind my back, unzipped the drab, ill-fitting gray bridesmaid dress, and let the cheap fabric pool onto the floor. I did not bother folding it. I left it lying there, a discarded symbol of the pathetic, subservient role my family had forced me to play for the past 33 years. I slipped into my crisp white dress shirt and buttoned it with deliberate, steady movements. I pulled on the perfectly tailored charcoal trousers and slid my arms into the $12,000 custom jacket. I adjusted my cuffs, staring at my reflection in the small mirror above the rectory sink. The transformation was instantaneous and profound. I was no longer the humiliated older sister, the family failure, or the convenient scapegoat. I was the newly appointed chief compliance officer of a global billionaire empire. I was a titan of industry. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, picked up my leather briefcase, and unlocked the door. I walked back through the empty chapel, my leather shoes echoing against the marble floors. The air was entirely silent, stripped of the chaotic energy that had consumed it just an hour ago. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out onto the front steps. The scene outside had completely dissolved into a bleak federal cleanup operation. The catering trucks were being towed away. The massive floral arrangements were being tossed carelessly into the back of dump trucks. The illusion of wealth and prestige had been entirely dismantled. And right in the middle of the wreckage, sitting directly on the cold concrete curb near the circular driveway, was Chelsea. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The $100,000 custom white silk wedding gown was gone, confiscated by the federal agents as illicit evidence. She was wrapped tightly in an oversized, cheap-looking navy blue windbreaker that a sympathetic caterer must have lent her. Her bare feet were dirty from walking on the asphalt. Her perfect blonde hair was a tangled, chaotic mess, and her face was heavily streaked with black mascara and ruined makeup. She was shivering slightly, staring blankly at the empty space where Jamal's rented luxury limousine had been parked earlier that morning. I walked down the stone steps, my posture straight, projecting an aura of absolute unbothered confidence. The sound of my footsteps drew her attention. She slowly turned her head, looking up at me from the gutter. Her eyes, which had burned with such toxic arrogance and entitlement just a few hours ago, were now hollow and completely defeated. She looked at my pristine Tom Ford suit, the physical manifestation of the immense success she had always tried to deny me. Kendra, Chelsea whispered, her voice weak and broken. It sounded like the voice of a lost child completely stripped of its usual venom. I did not stop walking. I maintained my steady pace, moving smoothly toward my parked car. Chelsea scrambled slightly, pulling the oversized windbreaker tighter around her shoulders as she realized I was not going to stop and comfort her. "What am I supposed to do now?" she sobbed, the sheer panic finally breaking through her shock. "Jamal is gone. Mom and Dad are losing the house. I have absolutely nothing left. I do not know how to pay for anything. What am I supposed to do?" I reached the handle of my car door. I paused for a brief second, turning my head to look back at the sister who had made my life a living hell. She was finally experiencing the exact vulnerability and helplessness she had inflicted upon me for decades. She wanted me to solve her problems. She wanted me to be the reliable older sister she could use and discard at her convenience. But I was legally estranged. I was completely free. "Get a job, Chelsea," I replied smoothly, my voice cold and entirely devoid of any pity. "I hear retail is hiring." I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the driveway, leaving her sobbing alone on the curb as the federal agents continued to dismantle the ruins of her fake billionaire life. 1 week later, I sat behind a massive desk carved from solid black walnut, overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline from the 80th floor of the D Corp Investments Tower. My new corner office was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass and polished steel, reflecting the immense power Desmond had handed me. As the newly appointed Chief Compliance Officer, I had spent the past 7 days aggressively restructuring the corporate security grid and rooting out every single vulnerability Jamal had exploited. The work was demanding, but the total control was exhilarating. My desk intercom buzzed sharply, immediately interrupting my deep review of a newly implemented firewall protocol. My executive assistant informed me that a man named Mr. Montgomery was waiting in the lobby, claiming to be the legal representative for Richard and Patricia. I smiled coldly, instructed my assistant to send him in, and leaned back in my leather chair. Mr. Montgomery confidently strutted into my office a few moments later. He wore a cheap, flashy suit and carried a scuffed leather briefcase, perfectly fitting the profile of a desperate ambulance chaser. He did not bother to wait for an invitation to sit. He dropped his heavy briefcase directly onto my pristine desk, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and looked at me with an insufferable smirk. "My clients are prepared to offer you a very generous settlement." Ms. Kendra Montgomery began, his tone dripping with unearned arrogance. "They are currently seeking $10 million in damages for severe emotional distress, public defamation, and immediate filial alimony to compensate for the tragic loss of their primary residence. If you refuse to pay this sum by the end of the business day, we will drag your name through civil court and expose your cruel behavior toward your own parents to the press." I did not laugh. I simply reached into my top drawer and pulled out a single laminated sheet of paper. I slid it across the smooth surface of the desk, stopping it right on top of his ridiculous lawsuit. "You might want to review that document before you threaten a senior corporate executive," I said calmly. "That is a legally binding family estrangement contract. Your clients forced me to sign it just hours before the federal raid. It explicitly includes a total severance of all mutual financial and legal obligations. By their own written demand, I am permanently indemnified from any of their debts, liabilities, or living expenses. Furthermore, any attempt to extort money from me using threats of public defamation directly violates federal SEC regulations regarding the harassment of corporate officers." Montgomery frowned, picking up the laminated contract. His smug expression vanished instantly as his eyes rapidly scanned the airtight legal clauses. I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly on the desk. "Let me guess," I continued smoothly. "Richard and Patricia told you they were the innocent victims of a corporate misunderstanding. They told you they had massive hidden assets and promised you a hefty percentage of the settlement. Did they happen to mention that the federal government officially blacklisted them from every banking network in the country, or that their bank accounts were completely seized because they willingly used their home as collateral to facilitate a massive money laundering scheme? Your clients are legally radioactive, Mr. Montgomery. They do not have a single cent to pay your retainer fees, and if you file this frivolous lawsuit, my corporate legal team will ensure you are disbarred by Friday." The lawyer physically recoiled as the reality of his situation set in. He realized he had been completely played by two desperate lying cowards. Montgomery aggressively shoved the lawsuit back into his scuffed briefcase, his face burning with intense humiliation and rage. "I am officially withdrawing my representation," he muttered angrily, turning on his heel and storming out of my glass office without another word. He was going to leave my parents exactly as they truly deserved, completely alone, financially ruined, and entirely defenseless against the world. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind the defeated lawyer, the encrypted, secure monitor on my desk suddenly flashed bright red. It was a high-priority alert from the elite cyber intelligence team I had established just 3 days ago. I tapped the screen, opening the classified notification. It was a digital surveillance report, originating directly from the federal holding facility where Jamal was currently awaiting trial. My eyes narrowed as I read the intercepted data. Chelsea had not hit rock bottom yet. Instead of getting a job like I suggested, my sister had just illegally bypassed federal communication protocols. She had secretly reached out to Jamal inside the maximum security prison, desperately trying to manipulate him into handing over the direct access codes to his hidden offshore crypto wallets. I stared at the blinking red notification on my monitor, a cold smile spreading across my face. Chelsea was incredibly predictable. She had lost her billionaire fantasy, her $100,000 wedding gown, and her social status all in a single morning, but she was still furiously digging through the wreckage for a payday. She thought she could outsmart the federal government by securing Jamal's unregulated digital assets before the auditors found them. She was severely underestimating the auditor currently sitting in the chief compliance officer chair. I immediately picked up my secure phone and dialed the lead FBI agent who had executed the raid at the chapel. I transmitted the intercepted surveillance data directly to his secure server. Within minutes, my cyber intelligence team was working in total synchronization with the Federal Cybercrimes Division. Jamal was not a criminal mastermind. His offshore cryptocurrency wallets were hidden behind basic commercial encryption layers that my software sliced through like a hot knife through butter. We tracked the digital footprint across 3 different international servers before finally locating the central ledger. It held roughly $200,000 in decentralized currency. It was the absolute last remnant of the money Jamal had stolen from the blue-collar workers of D Corp Investments. I watched my monitor as the federal agents officially executed the seizure protocols. The digital balances on the screen rapidly ticked down from 200,000 to absolute zero. The loophole was officially closed. Chelsea was not going to get a single cent. Later that afternoon, I sent my sister a brief text message instructing her to meet me. I chose a greasy rundown diner on the outskirts of the city, a place entirely devoid of crystal chandeliers, imported Wagyu beef, and high society guests. I arrived early, sitting in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, nursing a cup of black coffee. Chelsea walked through the glass door 20 minutes later. She looked exhausted and deeply uncomfortable in her surroundings. She was wearing cheap sweatpants and a faded sweater, constantly looking over her shoulder, as if the diner patrons were judging her. When she spotted me, her eyes lit up with a sudden desperate gleam of hope. She hurried over to the booth and slid into the vinyl seat across from me. "I knew you would finally come to your senses, Kendra," Chelsea said eagerly, leaning across the sticky laminate table. She did not bother to apologize for her insane behavior at the wedding. She went straight to the point. "I told Mom and Dad you would not actually let us starve. Things have been an absolute nightmare. The federal government froze all of my personal bank accounts because I was technically a beneficiary of Jamal's spending. I cannot even afford to buy groceries. But I knew you would bring a check to help me get back on my feet." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, looking at her with absolute detachment. "I did not bring you a check, Chelsea," I replied smoothly. "I brought you an update." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid it across the table. Chelsea frowned, picking up the document. It was a printed screenshot of Jamal's offshore cryptocurrency ledgers. She scanned the complex numbers, her eyes darting back and forth as she tried to comprehend the financial data. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising with sudden anxiety. "This shows a zero balance. Jamal told me he had hundreds of thousands of dollars hidden in these specific digital wallets. He gave me the access phrases just this morning." "He did have money in those wallets," I corrected her calmly. "But you made a massive mistake when you contacted a federal inmate using an unsecure prison terminal." My intelligence team flagged the communication immediately. I worked with the FBI to freeze and seize every single digital asset in those accounts about 2 hours ago. The money is completely gone, Chelsea. It has been returned to the corporate pension fund where it rightfully belongs. You tried to secure a payday from a thief, and you failed. Chelsea stared at the paper, the reality of her total and absolute financial ruin finally breaking her. The desperate hope in her eyes instantly morphed into a violent, unhinged fury. She let out a feral scream, completely ignoring the startled patrons around us. She lunged across the sticky table, her hands extended like claws, aiming directly for my face. But before her fingers could even brush my tailored suit jacket, a massive hand clamped down on her shoulder. My newly hired private security detail, a highly trained former military operative who had been sitting quietly in the adjacent booth, intercepted her mid-lunge. He casually hoisted my screaming sister into the air by the back of her sweater, dragged her effortlessly across the diner, and threw her out the front door onto the pavement. I watched through the diner window as Chelsea scrambled to her feet on the dirty pavement. She screamed obscenities at the glass door, her face red with humiliated rage, but my security detail simply stood inside with his arms crossed, completely unbothered. Eventually she turned and stormed off down the cracked sidewalk, her cheap windbreaker flapping in the cold wind. She was entirely out of options. I finished my black coffee in total peace, left a generous tip on the sticky laminate table, and walked out to my waiting vehicle. I had one final loose end to tie up before I could permanently close the book on my biological family. 2 days later, my chauffeur steered my sleek, black Maybach into the upscale suburban neighborhood where I had grown up. The tree-lined streets were quiet, bathed in the soft light of the early morning sun. We rolled to a smooth, silent stop across the street from the sprawling brick colonial house. It was the exact same house where I had spent decades being treated like a ghost. But today, the pristine facade of wealthy suburban perfection was completely shattered. 3 heavy federal transport trucks were parked aggressively across the wide driveway, their steel loading ramps fully extended. A team of federal marshals wearing dark windbreakers swarmed the property. They moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency, completely ignoring the horrified stares of the wealthy neighbors who were peering out from behind their expensive curtains. I sat comfortably in the climate-controlled cabin of my car, the dark-tinted windows shielding me from view. I watched impassively as the physical manifestations of my parents' boundless greed were dragged out the front door. The marshals carried out the massive antique mahogany dining table where I had been forced to sit in silence while Chelsea was praised. They dragged my father's expensive leather recliners onto the damp grass. The ornate crystal chandelier that used to hang in the grand foyer was carried out in pieces. Every single luxury item my parents had purchased to project an image of elite superiority was now sitting in the dirt, tagged with bright red federal seizure stickers. It was a complete and total liquidation of their entire fake reality. Richard stood near the front porch looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. He was wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and holding a single cardboard box containing the few personal clothing items the marshals had legally permitted him to keep. He did not yell. He did not try to exert his usual aggressive dominance. The fight had been completely beaten out of him by the swift crushing hammer of federal asset forfeiture. He just stared blankly at his ruined lawn, the reality of his impending homelessness finally breaking his mind. Patricia, however, was in the midst of a full-blown hysterical breakdown. She was darting wildly around the yard, her hair unkempt and her face pale. She desperately tried to grab a piece of her expensive imported porcelain collection from the hands of a passing agent. The marshal firmly shoved her back, issuing a stern verbal warning that made her flinch. She spun around hyperventilating, looking for anyone to help her. As she frantically scanned the street, her tear-streaked eyes caught the reflection of the sun glinting off the polished hood of my Maybach. She froze instantly. Even through her panicked state, she recognized the sheer luxury of the vehicle. She knew exactly who was sitting inside. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She dropped the small canvas bag she was clutching and sprinted across the perfectly manicured lawn, her shoes digging desperately into the soft dirt. She reached the street and threw her entire body against the side of my car. She slammed her hands flat against the tinted glass of the passenger side window, her face contorted in genuine, profound agony. I could hear her muffled sobs vibrating through the thick, soundproofed glass. "Kendra," she wailed loudly, her voice cracking with pure desperation. Kendra, please open the door. Please talk to me. We are so sorry. We lost everything. We have nowhere to go. Please just look at me. I leaned over and pressed the sleek silver button on the door panel. The tinted glass smoothly lowered just 3 inches. The crisp morning air and the raw, agonizing sound of her frantic weeping immediately filled the quiet, luxurious cabin of my car. Patricia let out a gasp of relief, grabbing the edge of the window with her trembling fingers, real tears pouring freely down her face as she looked into my eyes, expecting mercy. I looked back at her with absolutely no emotion. I am not here to gloat. Patricia, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. I am just here to make sure you actually leave. 6 months passed since the devastating morning of the ruined wedding, and the dust had finally settled. The transition from independent auditor to chief compliance officer of D Corp Investments had been intense, but I thrived in the high-pressure environment. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table in the executive boardroom, reviewing the quarterly financial reports projected onto the screen. Desmond sat to my right, leaning back in his leather chair, a rare, genuine smile gracing his usually stoic features. We had spent the last half-year meticulously restructuring the entire corporate security apparatus, hunting down every hidden vulnerability, and fully restoring the company's public reputation. The stock value has not just recovered, Kendra. Desmond said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute professional admiration. It has exceeded our most optimistic projections. The board of directors is completely thrilled with the new compliance protocols you implemented. We have officially secured 2 major international mergers this week entirely because our new security infrastructure is considered the most impenetrable in the financial sector. I tapped my stylus against the tablet, acknowledging the praise without letting it inflate my ego. The infrastructure is solid, Desmond, I replied smoothly. But we cannot afford to get comfortable. I have already flagged 3 minor discrepancies in the overseas routing accounts. They are likely just clerical errors, but I have deployed a strike team to audit the ledgers personally. Complacency is the enemy of security. Desmond chuckled, a warm, fatherly sound that I had never once heard from Richard. That is exactly why I hired you, he said, his eyes filled with genuine respect. You do not stop hunting. You have brought a level of absolute integrity to this firm that we desperately needed. You are an invaluable asset to this family, Kendra. I looked at the billionaire patriarch, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. For 33 years, I had desperately sought the approval and respect of a father who only saw me as a disappointing burden. I had practically destroyed myself trying to earn a single word of praise from a man who was entirely incapable of giving it. Yet here in the cutthroat world of global finance, I had found a mentor who valued my intelligence, respected my boundaries, and treated me as an equal. The toxic void my biological family had left behind was completely filled by the powerful chosen family I was building at D Corp. Our meeting was suddenly interrupted by a soft chime from the sleek intercom system embedded in the center of the conference table. I pressed the silver button connecting to my executive assistant in the outer lobby. Yes, Sarah, I answered, my tone professional. I apologize for the interruption. Ms. Kendra Sarah's voice filtered through the speaker, sounding slightly hesitant. But there is a man down in the main lobby causing a bit of a scene with the security desk. He does not have an appointment, and he is refusing to leave the premises. I frowned, glancing at the security monitors built into the wall. Is it a disgruntled client? I asked, preparing to alert the building's tactical team. No, ma'am, Sarah replied. He says his name is Richard. He claims to be your father. The name hung in the air of the executive boardroom, chilling the atmosphere instantly. Desmond immediately sat forward, his expression hardening back into the ruthless corporate titan. I can have security physically remove him from the building in less than 2 minutes. Desmond offered, his voice low and protective. You do not have to deal with him ever again. I looked at the live feed from the lobby security camera. Richard was standing near the front desk, arguing frantically with 2 large security guards. He looked absolutely terrible. His clothes were rumpled, his posture was hunched, and he carried a desperate, frantic energy that radiated even through the silent video feed. He looked like a man who had completely run out of options and was staring directly into the abyss of total ruin. "What does he want, Sarah?" I asked the intercom, my voice steady and cold. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "He is asking for a job, ma'am. He specifically told the guards that he heard D-Corp Investments was hiring for the overnight maintenance crew. He is begging to speak with you about a position as a janitor. He said he is facing immediate federal bankruptcy and has nowhere else to go." I stared at the screen, the absolute irony of the situation washing over me. The man who had mocked my career, stolen my college fund, and tried to frame me for federal wire fraud was now standing in the lobby of the empire I helped rebuild, begging to scrub the floors just to survive. "Hold him there, Sarah," I commanded, standing up from the conference table and smoothing the lapels of my Tom Ford suit. "I will be down in 5 minutes to handle this personally." I stepped out of the executive boardroom and walked down the quiet hallway toward the private elevator. The smooth descent gave me a moment to mentally prepare. For my entire life, Richard had been an intimidating figure, a loud, aggressive man who dominated every room. But as the silver elevator doors slid open to reveal the sprawling main corporate lobby, I immediately saw that the tyrant of my childhood was completely gone. Richard was standing near the massive marble security desk, looking incredibly small. He appeared to have aged 10 years in the span of 6 months. His hair had completely grayed. He was wearing a faded, poorly fitting polo shirt and scuffed khaki pants, a far cry from the expensive tailored suits he used to parade around in. His shoulders were hunched forward, and his hands trembled as he held onto a crumpled paper application. 2 large security guards stood nearby, watching his every move closely. I walked across the polished marble floor, my heels echoing through the cavernous lobby. Richard looked up. When his eyes locked onto mine, his breath hitched. He stared at my immaculate suit, my confident posture, and the sheer authority radiating from my position. I stopped a few feet away from him, signaling the security guards to stand down with a slight nod. They immediately stepped back. "Kendra," my father whispered, his voice raspy and weak. He swallowed hard, looking down at the floor before forcing himself to meet my gaze again. "Thank you for coming down. I know you had every right to let security throw me out into the street." "Why are you here, Richard?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly even and professional. He clutched the crumpled paper, his knuckles turning white. "I came here to apply for the overnight maintenance crew." He admitted, his voice cracking with deep shame. "We lost the house and cars. Patricia moved in with her sister and Chelsea is sleeping on a couch. I am staying at a cheap motel. I am facing total bankruptcy. I just need a job to survive. I will happily scrub the floors. I will take out the trash." I looked at him, searching for the familiar manipulative angle, the hidden demand, or the arrogant entitlement. But there was absolutely nothing. The absolute destruction of his fake reality had completely hollowed him out. Then Richard did something he had never done before. He began to cry. Not the loud, theatrical tears my mother used for manipulation, but quiet, agonizing tears of genuine regret. "I am so sorry, Kendra," he sobbed, his chest heaving as he finally let go of his pride. "I am not just sorry because I lost my money. I am sorry because I was a terrible father to you. I was blinded by my own vanity. I poured everything into your sister because she looked the part of the wealthy socialite I wanted to be. I treated you poorly because your intelligence intimidated me. I never saw your worth. I never realized that you were the truly brilliant one. I failed you completely." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looking at me with pure, unfiltered desperation. "I just want to make things right. Please let me work here. Let me prove I can be a better man." I stood in silence, letting his heavy confession settle between us. For decades, I had fantasized about this exact moment. I had dreamed of the day my father would finally admit he was wrong and beg for my forgiveness. And now that it was happening, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. "I accept your apology, Richard," I said softly, meaning every single word. "I forgive you for what you did to me. I am letting go of the anger because holding on to it only poisons my own future." Richard let out a massive sigh of relief, a fragile smile breaking across his tear-stained face. "Thank you, Kendra. Thank you so much. When can I start the maintenance job?" My expression hardened, returning to the cold chief compliance officer. "You misunderstand me, Richard," I replied smoothly. "I forgive you, but I am absolutely not hiring you." His fragile smile completely vanished. "But you just said you forgave me," he stammered in confusion. "I did," I explained, looking him directly in the eyes. "But forgiveness does not mean reversing the consequences of your actions. You made choices that destroyed your life, and now you have to face the reality of rebuilding it entirely on your own. I am not your safety net. You do not get to use my empire to clean up the mess you made." I turned my back on him and walked steadily toward the waiting elevator, leaving my broken father standing completely alone in the massive corporate lobby to figure out his own survival from absolute scratch. That evening, I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my downtown penthouse, the cool night wind rushing past me. I looked out over the glittering Chicago skyline, a sprawling sea of golden lights and endless possibilities. The city buzzed with life far below, but up here, 80 floors above the noise, I found a profound absolute silence. I rested my hands on the cold steel railing, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. For the first time in my 33 years of life, my lungs felt completely clear. I thought about the man I had left crying in the corporate lobby earlier that afternoon. A year ago, seeing Richard broken and weeping would have sent me into a desperate panic. I would have emptied my bank accounts, compromised my career, and sacrificed my own happiness just to earn a fleeting, conditional smile of approval from him. I would have played the obedient, invisible daughter, eager to absorb their toxic abuse just to keep the fragile illusion of our family intact. But as I watched the taillights of cars tracing red ribbons through the city streets, I realized something incredibly liberating. The family I had lost was not a loss at all. They were a toxic tumor. They were a parasitic growth that had fed on my ambition, my empathy, and my bank accounts for decades. They demanded constant sacrifice while offering absolutely nothing but disdain in return. When Patricia handed me that estrangement contract on the morning of Chelsea's ruined wedding, she thought she was issuing a death sentence. She thought she was throwing me away. In reality, she was the surgeon holding the scalpel, voluntarily cutting the tumor out of my life forever. I had spent my entire career performing forensic audits on massive corporations, hunting down hidden liabilities, and purging corrupt assets. But the most important audit I ever conducted was on my own personal life. I looked at the balance sheet of my family dynamics. The emotional deficits were staggering. The investments I made into their happiness yielded nothing but massive, painful losses. Cutting them off was not an act of malice. It was simply good business. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. The recovery from that surgery had been swift and miraculous. In the absence of their constant emotional drain, I had completely thrived. I had not just secured my own wealth, I had built an entirely new empire. D Corp Investments was stronger than ever, and I was at the absolute helm of its security. But more importantly, I had built my own chosen family. I had surrounded myself with a network of brilliant, loyal colleagues who respected my intellect. I had Desmond, a mentor who treated me with the fatherly pride and professional dignity I had always deserved. I had friends who celebrated my victories instead of plotting to steal them. I did not need Richard. I did not need Patricia. And I certainly did not need Chelsea. They were ghosts of a past life that I had successfully audited, closed, and permanently archived. I picked up the crystal glass resting on the small outdoor table beside me and took a slow sip of the vintage red wine. I thought about Jamal sitting in his concrete federal cell, stripped of his designer suits and his arrogant delusions. I thought about Chelsea working a minimum wage retail job, forced to finally understand the value of a single dollar. I thought about my parents evicted from their suburban castle, learning the hard way that you cannot mortgage your soul and expect to keep your house. They had orchestrated their own total downfall. I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. I only had to stand my ground, refuse to be their shield, and let the heavy, crushing weight of their own deceit collapse directly onto their heads. I handed them the rope and they eagerly tied their own knots. The skyline glittered brightly against the dark canvas of the night, a beautiful reminder that the best views always come after the hardest climbs. The air up here was thin, but it belonged entirely to me. There were no more apologies to make. There were no more expectations to fail. There was only the future wide open and completely under my control. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not destroying your enemies. It is letting them destroy themselves while you secure the bag. Have you ever had to legally cut off toxic family members? Tell me your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe in protecting your peace at all costs. Thank you for listening, and remember your worth is never defined by the people who are too blind to see it.